Welcome to Simplify Spend and Expense Management for a Hybrid Workforce, brought to you by the Controllers Council. My name is Neil Brown, Executive Director of the Controllers Council, and before I introduce our expert panelists and our partner sponsor, let me share some brief housekeeping items. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please use your GoToWebinar control panel to ask our experts questions. Next, this webinar is CPE eligible. We'll have 3 polling questions. So again, please use your GoToWebinar control panel to answer each poll and to benchmark your peers if you're not interested in CPE. Please allow at least 1 week for CPE certificates. Also regarding CPE, you'll receive a brief survey directly after the webcast, so please complete. And last but not least, you'll receive a link to this webcast via email in the next 24 hours, so no need for notes or screenshots. So with that, I'd like to share a word about our partner and sponsor, BILL, a leader in financial automation software for small and mid-sized businesses. Learn more at www.bill.com. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our expert panelists. Aaron Wilkinson is Senior Account Executive at BILL and a former CPA with a Master's of Accountancy from Southern Utah University and a BS Accounting from Brigham Young University. Joe Flesher is Webinar Content Marketing Manager for BILL, with more than 16 years experience, including CFO.com and Argyle. Gentlemen, welcome, and Joe, please take it away.
Thank you so much, and I'm so glad that we have the opportunity to get together right now. And one thing I do want to point out is that we will be having a discussion during which, as Neil said, we'll intersperse polling questions. So very excited to begin our discussion today and looking forward to covering some key topics. Now, I think it would be helpful if we outline what we're going to cover during our webinar. So here's a summary of what we're going to cover, and then I'm going to pose some questions to my colleague, Aaron Wilkinson. So among the topics we're going to address, and especially during the beginning, we're going to talk about how to adapt spend and expense management policies to accommodate hybrid and remote employees, and we'll define what we mean by a hybrid workforce. We'll later on in the webinar get into some detail as well about expense categories, in particular those that finance leaders should not overlook in a hybrid work environment. And we'll argue, or we'll make the case that a hybrid work environment is here to stay. And then later on, before we address some questions from attendees, we'll also talk about automation, virtual cards, and how to use a combination of these, among other approaches, to maintain visibility into and control over employees' expenses. So with that in mind, I want to start with our first question. And the first question I want to pose to you, Aaron. First of all, a two-part question. Aaron, you can also tell us a little bit more about yourself, and then after you do that, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Number one, what is a hybrid workforce? And then what challenges have companies encountered, indeed continue to encounter, with maintaining visibility into and control over expenses that remote and hybrid employees incur?
All right, thank you, Joe. Again, I'm excited to be here. I am a recovering CPA, or maybe some of you say I'm a washed up CPA. Did not renew my license, but I spent a lot of fun time at Deloitte and also as a small business owner. Excited to be speaking with you about best practices here today. But it's really interesting when we talk about a hybrid workforce. Just to define what a hybrid workforce is, it's really like a blended type of workforce comprised of employees who may work at the office or a centralized location, or maybe from a different remote location. So let's look at how it was, even before the pandemic. I know I had never really worked remote. Many of you may not have, while there were plenty of remote employees, but come the pandemic, right away it slams us to working remote. And as the months and years have gone by, many of us have adapted to a hybrid solution. So some of us, like myself, I go into the office maybe once or twice a week. I work from home the remaining times, but many of us have employees, or we have coworkers that are working out of the office, out of state, maybe even out of country. So things have definitely changed a lot, and has the challenges of working with a hybrid workforce. So I would really say a lot of those challenges are around like the communication, coordination, and compliance of dealing with our spend and expense management policies, or different policies that we have at the company. Before the pandemic, or let's say if you were pretty high, or a hybrid workforce before that, if we rewind a number of years ago, we could have just ran over real quick and asked somebody a question about a transaction, or maybe taped a note saying, hey, or submit your receipts to a Nerf ball and throwing it over the cubicle to a wall to get somebody to be compliant with a policy. Things have very much changed, and happy to start addressing some of those issues throughout this webinar. So back to you, Joe.
Thank you very much, Aaron. And we'll certainly talk about these challenges in greater detail. Before we do, we'd like to pose the first of our 3 polling questions. I'll turn it over to Neil to cover the polling question, and then I look forward to continuing our discussion.
All right, thank you, Joe. Quick poll question. My company continues to rely on manual processes to review and approve employees' expenses. Please select one of the following. So please take a few seconds to answer that. And even if you're not looking for CPE, it's interesting to benchmark your peers. Give it a few more seconds. Please use your control panel. All righty. Gonna close the poll and share the results. Joe, what are your thoughts?
Thank you very much, Neil. So before we continue, Aaron, I'd love to get your perspective. We can see that more than 3/4 of respondents at the very least agree that their companies continue to rely on manual processes to review and approve employees' expenses. Before we continue our discussion, Aaron, given this distribution of responses, does this reflect what you've observed?
Oh, absolutely. It's I have the opportunity to, within the last, let's say, even 12 months, to speak with hundreds of controllers and CFOs. And these companies range in having minimal spend at the company to potentially millions. And I would say a large percentage of them are still relying on very manual processes at the company.
So for those who have responded and indicated your company does continue to rely on manual processes, you're not alone. And we're going to talk about some of the challenges, but also some of the ways to address some of these challenges. So I'd like to now continue our discussion. And in particular, what I'd like to do is pose my next question, which I think is pretty clear given the responses from attendees. Aaron, why do many companies continue to rely on manual processes to review and approve employees' expenses?
Great question, Joe. This makes me think of right when I got out of college as a young staff accountant at a publicly traded gas utility. And I was in charge of reconciling a lot of accounts. Every day I'd reconcile a new account. And as I was reconciling one account for the first time, I was looking through the manual on how to reconcile that account, and I came across a procedure that required me to use a very old version of Excel. It was out of date. I knew how to run this better in a new version of Excel. But I went to my supervisor, who I loved. She was awesome and amazing. She'd been with the company for 30+ years. And I said, hey, is it all right if I update this procedure with the newer version of Excel? And she said, Aaron, this procedure has worked well for a long time. I don't want you to change it. Leave it as it is. Do it how it says it in the manual. So for my supervisor, I can understand that change is hard. And sometimes we just don't know of a better way to do something. I also remember when I was a small business owner, sometimes I just didn't even have time to figure out something new to do because you have a lot on your plate. So there's a lot of reasons why people may not want to have or to update a new process or automate things. But in general, change can be hard, especially as we've had so many changes to our, the way we function and work throughout our lives in the last couple of years. Back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Aaron. I want to get into this a little bit more. We're going to get into some details soon enough. And so one thing you've brought up is risk, and the perception is that it is better to leave things. Oh, we'll get to risks too. And actually, this is a great question to consider given your response, Aaron. Before we get into the risks themselves, Aaron, I just want to follow up on what you just said, and that is that the perception that you conveyed is that it is better to continue doing what we're doing than run the risk of changing it. And there seems to be an underlying assumption that it is riskier to make the change, that the change will make things worse. I realize it's a loaded question, but that seems to be the underlying assumption.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes we can feel that way. It can be very difficult to make change. But I think as a lot of us have even transitioned into like a hybrid work environment, we've seen that even though change can be hard, there's a lot of efficiencies that can come from change.
Exactly. And so now I want to pose the question and give you the opportunity to respond to it, having to do with the risks of continuing to doing what we're doing if what we're doing is relying on manual processes. So I'd love to hear your thoughts, not only about the underlying thought process, but also concerning the actual procedures themselves, the risks that underlie continuing to depend on manual processes to review and approve employees' expenses, including but not limited to those expense reports going in the manila folders, for example. Like, what are the risks that you've observed? And then we'll talk about how to address them.
Yeah, great question, Joe. I think a lot of the risks are really going to depend a lot on how much you're spending or even the size of your company. I used to audit, and probably many of you used to audit publicly traded companies, and you would see, very large controls in place with segregations of duties. But as your company gets smaller, it's oftentimes hard to create segregation of duties. So certain people do certain things within the company to make sure that not everybody can make all the decisions. And when you're a smaller company, oftentimes you have to rely on the trust system, which unfortunately is one of the worst controls out there. And you have to rely on people instead of either machines or software to do certain things. So because we're relying on people, human error is a huge component of it. So that's a huge risk. Or when somebody is bottlenecked, or when a process is bottlenecked by one person or one department, that can really slow the turnaround time or the process of this. Also, I see a lot where they talk about one of the risks is the inefficient use of staff time and unnecessary work because it's very manual in nature in managing their expenses. And this can be a risk to a company in a lot of different ways, such as the perception that the employee has on the company. Now, let me explain this with a little story. I was actually talking with a CFO who was talking about their process and kind of complaining about or he actually said, Aaron, I was not hired to do all of this manual work. I was hired to do financial analysis. And I spend a good amount of my time just simply doing manual work around company expenses. So if you have an employee that has a perception that the company is maybe behind the times, disorganized, is not willing to change and implement best practices that can have maybe perhaps poor perception by the employees about the company. And so those are just some of the risks that we can have. But I love to try to automate things as quick as possible to help eliminate that risk that you have from that manual process.
Thank you, Aaron.
Okay.
I want to stay on the slide for a bit because you've brought up two components. So first of all, or two considerations. One is that finance executives, that's a classic complaint, that finance executives get all this training, they go to school, as you did as well, and then they end up having to deal with the minutia of, let's say, expense reports. So there's a two-part follow-up question I just want to pose to you, Aaron, and that is, number one, expense reports. Why? That's number one. And then number two, when we're considering remote and hybrid employees, manual processes, they're not just bottlenecks. Like they actually can prevent expense management from being functional operations. So I just wanted to get your thoughts, number one, on the whole concept of expense reports, which, yes, they existed in the 1990s, for example, but also the particular risk of managing expenses, employee expenses for remote and hybrid employees.
Yeah, that's a great question to bring up. If you look at the whole reason for accounting, it's to provide clarity behind business operations. And so an expense report still is an essential function of just gathering that data to help you know what's going on in the company. Also, if employees are using their own cards, you got to reimburse them. So there's a lot of reasons why you would want to have an expense report. Now, a lot of companies are still doing it how it was done in the 90s. Things have changed. If you say a problem, let's say you were to look at having a hybrid work environment create something new, or sometimes we feel like it's a problem. We're like, expense reports, managing this spend is a problem. Well, there's always a business opportunity around it. That's why companies like Divvy, or you might be familiar with Concur or Expensify, come around and create solutions to these problems. So I would look at any problem that you have in your processes, whether that be with expense reports, expense management, approvals, all of that. There's probably some great company out there that has made that so much easier for you guys to handle, allowing you to be able to focus on what your core competencies are of gathering wonderful information for the company so you can manage and run the company better and make money.
Exactly. And in terms of enabling companies to focus on core competencies, this leads to my next question, Aaron, that I want to pose to you, which is, how would you advise, especially now that we're living in a time where many companies maintain a hybrid workforce, how would you advise that companies adapt spend and expense management policies? Now, we're going to distinguish between policy and procedure. We'll get into procedure a little later, but right now I want to transition from procedure to policy. How would you recommend companies adapt spend and expense management policies to accommodate hybrid and remote employees?
Yeah, well, one of my role models in life said that when you're ever trying to get anybody to do anything, it's 10% commitment and 90% follow-up. So oftentimes, well, all the time, companies are trying to implement spend and expense policies. Sometimes we say when they get hired, we're like, okay, read the employee manual, the policy's there, but it's more than just that. That's only 10% of the equation. We need to continually be following up on those policies. So not only do people remember, because if you're like me, like I swear 10% goes in and 90% goes right out. So oftentimes we learn through repetition. So it's important to communicate spend and expense management policies regularly. So I would do that, make sure it's done digitally, make sure it's done often and frequently. Now there are softwares like Divvy that can help build your policy into place, so it's easy to communicate that on a regular basis. But even if you are still using your manual process, I would recommend simplifying it and speeding up that process for which approvals are taking place. But finally, really, you know, I would recommend automating those workflows for reviewing and approving employees' expenses, or just automating everything. And again, there are a lot of great softwares out there that can help you do that.
Thank you, Aaron. And so one thing I wanna stay on this slide for a bit. So it used to be, even pre-pandemic, where the typical approach that a company would take was communicate the spend and expense management policy, maybe even provide digital access to it. But what companies did not necessarily do is think about how to change them. Where I think companies have really struggled, and we'll get into this in a bit, is, for example, during the pandemic, and I think attendees are going to have questions about this as well. During the pandemic, there were, first of all, procedures that had to change. There was a need to automate workflows, but even the nature of the expenses changed, and the urgency of reimbursing them sometimes changed, because employees' offices were often either their homes or other locations. Let's say if they chose to go to other locations. The point being that it wasn't just that it was necessary to communicate the policy. The policy itself had to change. It had to accommodate remote and hybrid employees, and it had to accommodate different types of expenses. So just anticipating some attendees' questions, and also just following up on your answer, I just want to give you the opportunity to elaborate further, because especially with regard to automating workflows, that becomes necessary to accommodate not only the locations where employees may be, if they're remote or hybrid, sometimes coming into the office, but also the very types of expenses that remote and hybrid employees are likely to incur. So I just want to give you the opportunity perhaps to elaborate on that, and we'll discuss this further as we address attendees' questions later in the webinar.
Yeah, great question. So as we work from home, our offices have changed. Everything has changed. So home office expense has been huge. Really a lot in the early days. But as you hire on new employees who may just be coming out of school, who may be coming from a different job that wasn't remote or hybrid, there's going to continually be desks and chairs and printers and monitors, computers, laptops, all sorts of different things. But in addition to that, a lot of companies will offer per diem expense, food allowance, software purchases. So there is still a lot of similar expenses. You can have an AP person or accounts payable person working from home, paying a lot of bills. But there's just a lot of expenses and perks related to working at home that have changed, that should be continually watched. But I do want to point out also, some of the things that have changed as well. So if you have a manager or an accounts payable person that is spending money using a company card, it can change. Like if you're a company that has one credit card and is expecting somebody to use that card, I've seen some companies, they'll take pictures of that card, text it or email over to an employee, which necessarily isn't a best practice. So how can you allow employees who are remote to spend the company money in a way that is safe and secure? Again, companies like Divvy can help you solve that issue.
Absolutely, and I think we will address that as well, which is, the procedure has to factor in security in all respects as it relates to financial transactions, and certainly, especially having an image of a credit card, a company credit card, floating around, probably, as you said, not the best practice. So before we continue our discussion, I'd like to turn the floor back to Neil to pose our second of 3 polling questions.
Will do. Let's launch this poll. Simplifying spend and expense management is a top priority for my company. Oh, this should be easy to answer. Please take a moment to answer. Could be a trick question because Sure, it's important, but is it as important as revenue or some others? But anyways, we got almost 90% voting, so I'm going to close poll and share results.
Thank you, Neil. And as with our first polling question, Aaron, I'd love to see your thoughts. So, I mean, of course, okay, so I'll put it this way. On the one hand, one could interpret these results as, of course. On the other hand, it's interesting that attendees perceive that either simplifying spend and expense management is, but perhaps attendees are interpreting this statement to be ought. Simplifying spend and expense management ought to be a top priority. Either way, what have you observed recently, especially recently with regard to the companies, Aaron, that you've worked with? And this is before we continue our discussion. What have you observed, Aaron, with the companies that you've worked with in terms of how they understand spend and expense management? Are they acknowledging that it's a top priority? What have you seen recently?
Well, this definitely is an interesting question, Joe. I talk with a lot of people who say it is a top priority, but when you talk more about it, there oftentimes are other higher priorities. For example, we're in an economic slowdown, or they're implementing a new accounting software, and they have a lot going on. So not always is it a top priority. So I'm actually kind of surprised by these results, saying that everybody, or almost 75% is saying that it's a top priority. Now, I would love to say that it should be a top priority just because it's something simple and easy to do, in comparison to dealing with a financial slowdown or implementing a new accounting software.
Certainly. Of course, this is an audience that's interested in simplifying spend and expense management. So it looks like we have the right audience. If 75% of respondents say simplifying spend and expense management is a top priority. So that's actually reassuring in the context of this webinar. That said, I'd like to now move on to our next question that I want to pose to you, Aaron. And this is, there are two goals here. There's streamlining, simplifying spend and expense management, and then there's figuring out the best way to do it. I want to get your thoughts, Aaron, on what companies should do, even before they've made decisions. What should they be focusing on? What should they be thinking about? Number one, as they're considering whether to seize opportunities to streamline spend and expense management, and then beyond that, figuring out exactly how to go about doing so.
Perfect. Yeah, that totally makes sense. If you are, in the category of the 75% that think that it should be a priority, or you would like to make it a priority, or it is a priority, I would just make sure to make that decision a priority at the company. Make it a goal, give yourself a timeline, but as you do that, do your research. We're big on due diligence. As I remember in school with auditing, when they were teaching us to be an auditor, they said, it's okay to be professionally skeptical. So as we're professionally skeptical, we do our due diligence, we do our research. I would again highly recommend companies look into software to automate a lot of this manual process for you, so that you can allow your staff to do more important things for the company. So look into different companies. See what works best for the size of your company, for the type of your company. And I would recommend checking out 2 or 3 different companies, whether it be on their website or even just doing a demo. But when you do find a company, that's great. Or when you find a company that works for you. But I would recommend acting quickly, because I know you have to, like, when you have hard things to do, you just got to swallow the frog. Take that time, get it implemented, disseminate it through your company, and just get it done with. Because as soon as you're able to use to automate the process, it's going to save you more time. So it's a little upfront investment, but in the long run, it's going to save your company a lot of man hours and potentially dollars, and hopefully potentially catch a lot of that human error or the mistakes that can be provided with that you can see with a manual process.
That's a really good point, Aaron. I want to stay on this slide for a little bit. So another aspect of due diligence is coming up with the kinds of questions that help inform decisions. And before we move on to our next question during our discussion, Aaron, anything that you would advise that attendees keep in mind, as they're doing their due diligence, anything that should be at least top of mind, not getting into the weeds, but at the very least top of mind. I think you've already hinted at one, which is making sure that we reinforce segregation of duties, for example, make sure that we have secure payment methods. But is there anything else that attendees ought to keep in mind as they're doing their due diligence?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of different things that come up to mind. Number one is, what is your business like? Are you an international company? Are you publicly traded? Are you a smaller but growing quickly business? Are you just a startup, so you're pre-revenue? There are different companies that, or softwares that will cater to those different type of companies. So number one, try to find something that's going to fit well with your company. So if you're a giant, international company, you may not want a really simple, software, but maybe something like Concur, which is, well fit for a very large entity. I would also look at, what are you willing to do with your credit cards? Like Divvy by Bill, for example. We're a free to use expense management software connected to a Visa Business card. So if you are married to your Amex card and you will never, ever, ever switch, well, Divvy by Bill may not be a very good fit for you. So I would, see like, what are you trying to accomplish? But those are a couple of the high level things that I would look at checking out first when you're doing your research in companies.
You, Aaron. And I'm seeing we are receiving some great questions from attendees, and I assure attendees we will get to it as we can. Before we do, though, I have one more question for you. It's an overarching question, and that is key points attendees ought to keep in mind. I just want to let attendees know, after we address this overarching question, we'll pose our third polling question, and then I'm looking forward to addressing some great questions from attendees. But first, Aaron, what key points, what key takeaways should attendees keep in mind?
Awesome. I would just love to stress that our workforce is probably going to continue to get more and more hybrid. As maybe I referenced this earlier, but a study showed that 66% of executives are considering reconfiguring their office spaces to accommodate a more hybrid workforce. So we can either fight against it, or we can embrace it and be the type of company that attracts the best talent. Next, there are easier ways than to manage your spend and expense process than relying on manual processes. Automation is a wonderful way to save you guys time. And then as you automate finally your expense management process, this really will give your company the time back that it needs to focus on what is most important and focus on your core competencies.
Absolutely. And I want to stay on this slide for a bit, because I think one of the considerations is when we consider the evolution of the workforce, there were advantages that many companies gained during the pandemic. And it meant that they could draw from larger labor pools, in effect. So when you say the workforce will become more hybrid, this is actually a scenario where we've learned from a challenge. You were talking about that earlier, and we've learned from a challenge. We've actually figured out how to make workforces attract wider range of employees, both geographically and otherwise, in terms of skills that they offer. So hybrid workforce is a positive development. What that means, though, is that to your point, it's not like you can walk over to somebody and give that person, say, a spreadsheet that lists one's expenses. So I wanted to just follow up on your comment earlier, as well as your response to this question, before we move to our third polling question. Aaron, what have companies gained in effect through being able to maintain hybrid workforces, and actually how might this help companies improve their ability to manage employees' expenses?
Yeah, well, one thing that I've really seen that it's done, and during the pandemic, I had my own small company with 17 employees, and as we adopted more software and adopted to a more remote workforce, we saw that we do not have to stay in a local geographic area, and we can actually expand out to the far reaches of our state, or even far reaches of the country, and even Mexico and Canada, and we were able to grow our company significantly during the pandemic because of that. So again, as you said, Joe, with every challenge comes a potential a bright spot, or something we can learn from it. As we adapt to this hybrid work environment where we're adapting all the software, it can give us the foundation to be able to grow our company in different ways that may not have been as obvious or available before the pandemic, or before we really started digging into this hybrid workforce.
Exactly, and I also think, to your point as well, Aaron, and we'll talk about this as we address great questions from attendees. The notion that, to be blunt, the notion, and then I promise after we consider this point, we'll move on to our third polling question. But first, the notion that one can reduce employees' expenses to meals and travel, that is outdated. Now employees' expenses can encompass so many different things. Essentially, if an employee's home or where an employee resides is equivalent to an office, then one has to account for a wider variety of expenses. So we're going to address this later on during Q&A with attendees, but I do want to give you the opportunity to address that, because I think there was a perception, even recently, and certainly pre-pandemic, that one could reduce employees' expenses to meals and travel, business meals, business travel. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think a lot of the reduction in expense that can come from a hybrid workforce is really the lease on your office. If you have multiple office spaces around the country, around the world, and you're able to get rid of some, that can be a material amount that you can reduce. But kind of what you're saying is, if you are using Post-it notes in the office, you're probably going to use Post-it notes at home. If you need that ergonomic chair in the office, you're probably going to want that at home. If you are used to catered lunches at the office, well, you as an employer may potentially want to give a Grubhub allowance. Not a lot of companies do that, but a lot are doing that more and more. So just because there's a reduction in lease expense doesn't mean there's going to necessarily be a reduction in all of the other expenses that an employee or a reduction in the the benefits or the things that that an employee needs to do their job properly and efficiently.
Thank you, Ron. I'm glad you said that, because I think that really speaks to the business value of employee expense management, but also I want to say I don't want to say complexity, but perhaps greater variety of expenses. So we'll explore this further. Before we do, I want to turn the floor back to Neil to pose our third of 3 polling questions.
All right. Within what time frame, if any, does your company intend to simplify spend and expense management? Please select one of the following. Another easy question. We're not making it hard here. These are easy. All right, it looks like vast majority have voted, so let's go ahead and share results. I don't know if you want to really cover this that much, Joe, but
you know what? I just want to follow up, actually. So thank you, Neil. And then I'm really excited about the questions from attendees. So one thing, just want to acknowledge Aaron, that we posed the previous polling question. To what extent does this distribution of responses in terms of time sensitivity dovetail with your observations about the extent to which companies perceive simplifying spend and expense management?
Yeah. Okay, yeah. It's interesting as I look over this. Obviously you have that, down at the bottom, my 22% my company does not intend to do so. That is not surprising at all. Oftentimes companies, they say, well, we don't have that many expense reports. It only takes us a few hours a week. So they may not even intend to do so. Doesn't surprise me, whereas some automation can really help them grow and expand the business. I also love my company has already done so at 27%. A lot of companies have either built in, I run across a lot of like in-house built systems. Some of the challenges of that can be if that employee leaves, then that process falls apart. So these responses are actually not outside of what I would expect. I always like to see within more than 6 months, so 22%, it's something that's not the biggest priority. They want to get to it if they can make time. So that's why I always say, like, if you want to do it, understand that this doesn't have to be as hard as implementing an accounting system. It can actually be a relatively easy process to automate things or to implement some software that will help you automate the process for you.
That's a really good point. Also, the notion of simplifying is not having an individual maintain a paper spreadsheet, for example, and then checking off boxes and asking for hard copy receipts, for example, or photocopies of receipts. That's not simplifying, and you've raised a great point that when you make it dependent on the management of spend and expenses, employee spend and employee expenses dependent on individuals, there are significant risks there. I'd like to now move to our Q&A slide, and I do want to call your attention, attendees, to this QR code. You can scan this code, and we'll keep this up for a while to schedule, if you would like, a personalized demo with Aaron, who, as you can see, is an expert in spend and expense management. And indeed, we have a number of great questions from attendees that I want to address. And one of these questions that an attendee has posed, and Aaron, I think you can definitely appreciate this this question. It has to do with doing the research. Where does one begin when doing the research? What would you advise there? And then I know we'll have some other great questions as well.
Yeah, great question. I have a few kids, and they always say, when they have a question, they say, can I borrow your phone and Google the answer to that question? Google is a great place to start. I would love it if you guys started with me and booking 15 minutes on my calendar so we can go over your process and see what that looks like. And I can also point you in some other directions that you may want to look. But I would also, what's great about people in these forums or other colleagues is see what they're using, see what's working well. I would also look on like G2. It's a review website where you can review other different companies or companies similar to Divvy by Bill and other companies out there to see how good they are or are not in the eyes of their customers.
Thank you, Aaron. Here's another question from an attendee. An attendee asks, and we've talked about this, but let's get into it. Attendee asks, Aaron, what are examples of expenses that remote or hybrid employees often incur that companies typically overlook? How can companies establish policies and procedures to factor in these types of expenses?
Okay, yeah, so we did cover a lot of that already. A lot of office expense, a lot of or home office expense, software purchasing, that type of things, and really establishing the policies and procedures are easy, but implementing it and communicating can be the hard part. So I would just like to remind people that just because they're not in the office doesn't mean they're not going to need all the things that they typically would need in the office at their home. They're still going to need a lot of that to perform their jobs properly.
Certainly. Related question, and actually this would apply to all types of employee expenses, is the notion of scalability, but also location dependence. So many, this happened a few years ago, but we're still experiencing the after effects where perhaps the decision about how much something should cost is dependent on a number of factors, effects of inflation, effects of location. So I would like to get your thoughts on behalf of the attendee regarding what considerations should go into setting a ceiling, if you will, when determining whether or not to approve a particular category of expense. And again, what factors, including inflation, location dependence, among other considerations, should inform decisions about approving certain types of employee expenses, particularly the types of expenses we just talked about.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm sure we could spend a lot of time on talking about, how much things should be approved for, how much people should get paid in different locations across the country. I have a lot of friends who work for California companies, but they live in maybe like Kansas or Missouri, where cost of living is less. But I think really to kind of like simplify things and get it down to the heart of it. A lot of times companies will give everybody a Visa or an Amex card with a $5,000 balance. There's not a lot of ways you can actually have approvals behind that before they just start spending. And so many companies, they get their bank statements in or they get the expense report in, and they're like, you spent way too much. This was not approved, and they already spent the money. So I would say more than anything, more than even digging into the topic of how much they should actually spend for something, is what process can you put in place that can allow you to actually approve an expense before they actually make it. That's where software can come into place to help facilitate approvals for purchases before it's actually made, and before a rogue employee goes and maxes out their $5,000 to $10,000 credit limit on their Visa or Amex.
Aaron, I really want to applaud what you've said, and I'll tell you why. Because in the absence of automation, we're reinforcing a model that really shouldn't exist. I think that's not just an opinion; it's probably even a fact. So the model used to be out of necessity, where one had an expense report, one submitted receipts, and so out of necessity, the quote-unquote expense report preceded any decision about approval. But what you're proposing is through automation reversing that, where there's a limit. Yes, there might be approvals with regard to individual expenses, but you're reversing the process. It sounds like, and automation is allowing us to do that. We'll get into some other reasons why we can do that, but is that correct?
No, absolutely. I see companies that they say, hey, look, Aaron, I'm very happy. I love my team. I trust my team. I worked with them for a long time. I can give them a $5,000 monthly balance or credit limit on their card, and I know they're not going to overspend. But I also work with companies that say, or I guess going to that first company, that gives a $5,000 credit limit. They trust them. They just need to get those receipts in quicker. They need to get everything in quickly so they can reconcile quick. But then on the other side of that, companies will say, hey, I don't. These are new employees. I have a very transitory or revolving workforce. I want them to be able to have a card so that we don't have to do this card sharing, which makes reconciliation very difficult. But I want them to have a card, and on their mobile app, I want them to be able to just quickly request, let's say, $200 to fill up a truck, or $100 to buy a lunch or whatever it might be with a client. I want them to be able to do that quickly, but I don't want them to be able to have a large credit limit so they can overspend. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Absolutely. And, certainly the sort of madman era expense account, and we're certainly exaggerating, but that is definitely a thing of the past. So you've raised two questions that have triggered some inquiries from attendees. Namely, Aaron, attendee asks, what risks, and I think we've already started to address this, but perhaps we could dig into this a little more. Attendee asks, Aaron, what risks are companies and employees most likely to encounter if employees have the option of charging work-related expenses to personal cards, and when we say we won't just limit ourselves to personal cards. Let's say whatever personal digital wallet one has. And related to that question, how can companies, frankly, eliminate these risks?
Yeah, so it's fun to talk with companies who they're like, no, employees do not make personal expenses and submit for reimbursement. Or other companies that say, we only want employees to use their cards because they'll really think about the spend before they make it. Now, platforms like Divvy will help accommodate for both companies, but I've worked for companies that have done both. I've also audited a lot of companies that have done both. It's always interesting to see the fraud where an employee, or let's actually go to my favorite new television show, The Office. I'm on episode or season 7. I'm not all the way through it, but I love to see the jabs where somebody submits an expense report and they're like, no, we will not approve your veneers that you got, even though it'll make you sell better, right? So there's a lot of employees that will bake in personal expenses that are masked as company expenses. That's huge. Also, you have like the fun frauds where an employee might submit a legit expense for the company. And because the company gets lots of requests for reimbursements, a quarter or two later, they'll submit the same exact invoice or receipt, hoping that the employer doesn't see that again, and then they just reimburse them a second time for it. That happens very frequently. And then also another risk I see is your management at your companies, they want information quickly, so they can make appropriate decisions about the company. But as sometimes people take maybe a little bit longer or maybe way too long to submit these expenses, that really slows down the information that you can provide to management that will help them to make better business decisions that will help progress the company, which not only makes the company grow, but gives you job security. And last thing I want to touch on is from my own personal experience. When I was a financial statement auditor at Deloitte, I made a whopping $41,000 a year out of college back in like 2009, 2010 timeframe. And I traveled 6 months out of the year and spent $1,500 to $2,500 a month. And I had 2 kids, and me having to float that money because I used a personal card was really annoying. And sometimes it would take a month to get reimbursed for that. Luckily, I had savings because I'm a weird saver. But it really kind of gave me a bad feeling about working for a company that required me to use my own personal card. So I know me personally, I would be very hesitant to work for another company that required me to float company expenses for 1, 2, 3, 4 plus weeks at a time.
Yeah, I just, before I get to the next question from an attendee, Aaron, I want to acknowledge there are two sides to that. So there's the risk for the company because it can't plan, because sometimes, and I'm sure you've seen this, sometimes a year goes by between the incurring of the expense and the submission of the expense report. That probably even happens now, and that's just absurd. So that's the risk for the company. But then for the employee, oh my gosh, I mean, so this gets to the next question, where I think we have within the question a potential solution to this challenge. An attendee asks, Aaron, what is a virtual card? How does it differ from other types of cards?
Yeah, glad you brought that up. Virtual cards are great. It's just like a regular credit card, but it's virtual. At Divvy, for example, our virtual cards take 60 seconds to make or less, and you can access it on a mobile app or a computer. So it's just essentially a credit card with a number, an expiration date, CVC code. But some of the different use cases for it are, well, actually, let me tell you a quick story that I remember from when I ran a business. I had one business credit card, and I had about 75 plus vendors that I would, that had that card information for reoccurring or for regular expenses. But it seemed like once a year I would get fraud on that one card, so I had to cancel that card, order a new one, and then update the credit card information with those 75 vendors. Now with a virtual card, what you can do is if you have a reoccurring payment, like with your Amazon Web Services or your internet or your utilities, you can actually make a virtual card that's attached to that one vendor. You can, with a lot of companies like with Divvy, you can make that transaction automatically code to a certain GL account or a class code or a project code or a location code. So it really helps to streamline things. So if you get fraud on that one card, it doesn't affect any of the other cards at the company. So there's a lot of automation behind those regular expenses or those expenses that you have with a big vendor. Additionally, from an employee standpoint, a lot of companies, they have employees that they're like, it's not worth it to send them a plastic card because they only make a few expenses a year. Well, a virtual card is something that they can start using super quick and start making expenses, and then the company can turn it off if they'd like. From a personal standpoint, I once used a virtual card because I was traveling to a trade show. I forgot my physical card. So on my mobile app, I whipped up a virtual card in 60 seconds and I attached it to my Apple Pay and started spending that way for all the company expenses that I needed to make at that convention. So there's a lot of different uses of virtual cards. They should always be free. No company should ever charge you to use a virtual card.
That's a great point. And in answering this question, you've addressed some of the challenges that come up when using, for example, one's personal card, for example, out of necessity. Now, I want to acknowledge we've received a lot of great questions. Any questions we haven't had a chance to address, we'll plan to follow up on after our webinar. I would like to move on to the next slide, which will display the same QR code. We'd like to invite attendees to scan this QR code if you'd like to schedule a personalized demo with Aaron, who, as you can hear and see, is an expert on spend and expense management. Before we wrap up, I just want to thank you, Aaron, for sharing your expertise. And what I'm going to do now is turn the floor over to Neil to conclude our webinar. Before I do, once again, Aaron, it's been a pleasure to speak with you and learn from you about spend and expense management.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Neil.
Back to you, Neil.
And thank you, Aaron and Joe, for these great insights. Many thanks to Bill, the leader in automating AP payments and more. And last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our attendees and great success to you in 2023. Goodbye for now.